Okay, so again, David Hume is the focus, and if we have time, we'll maybe even get started on Kant, Immanuel Kant. If we do, we won't say much about him. I think there's quite a bit to cover already in just this short article by David Hume. But we'll see what happens. We'll go for about 90 minutes like we normally do. Take a break, and then whatever we have time we have left, we'll sort of play by ear, I guess. But certainly next week for sure. There's no doubt about it. By next week we will start on Kant. So I would start reading that chapter. Let me open my chat box here. So I got the chat box open. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow. And I think I can go ahead. I'm going to skip the first few slides because we covered this. We got to start on David Hume last week at the end of class. So, and as usual, people keep popping into my wait room. So if I pause and I hesitate, that's what I'm doing. I'm clicking people in and letting them in class. So try not to let it distract you. So anyway, like I said, I'm going to skip these first few slides. We did a little bit about his background. I'll start with this one, but so this slide here, we were talking about this last class at the end. I think I even read this quote. I might not have, but I'll read it again regardless. And the sort of the main point that I want to recap a little bit is the fact that David Hume is an empiricist. So empiricism is normally, it's understood as a certain type of epistemology. It's a theory of knowledge. So, we're covering aesthetics, theories of art and beauty. So, epistemology, what does that have to do with it? Well, there's a lot to do with it. You'll see especially when we get to Kant, this is important. That's why I emphasize it so much, even though you don't really, I guess, need to know that to understand this reading. But you're certainly going to need to know it to fully understand Kant. So that's why I'm introducing you all this jargon. Okay. So again, as an epistemologist, as somebody who's doing philosophy of knowledge, a theory of knowledge, David Hume is an empiricist. So what that means is he thinks all knowledge is going to be based on your experience, what you've experienced, what you've seen through your senses, what you felt in your emotions. All that you know is gained through experience. All your thoughts and ideas are gained from experience. We were talking last class about, the flavor of an avocado. How do you know what an avocado tastes like? Well, you only know what an avocado tastes like because you've actually had that experience of tasting an avocado. If you've never tasted an avocado, you wouldn't have an idea or a thought. You wouldn't know. You wouldn't be able to imagine, or if somebody said, hey, it tastes like avocado, you wouldn't know what they're talking about. I mean, you might be familiar with the fruit. You might have seen it in a grocery store, but you don't know the flavor. Okay, so that's the basic thing. So for him, this is true of anything, and it's no less true about art than it is about avocados. So when we're talking about standards of taste, which is the title of his essay, all of our standards of taste are based on experience. So given that, it seems like everyone's taste is going to be their own. And on the one hand, Hume is going to agree with that, but there's going to be a big caveat, which we'll get to here in a minute, once we get through these first few slides. So let me read this quote. And I think I read it last time, but it'll help us kind of get back to where we left off. So we're often prejudiced in our taste. We have a certain bias in our taste, he says. The great variety of taste as well as of opinion that prevails in the world is too obvious not to have come to everyone's attention. Men who never go far from home can see differences of taste within the narrow circle of people they are acquainted with, even when the people have been brought up under the same government and have early imbibed the same prejudices. Those who are in a position to take a broader view, in which they contemplate distant nations and remote ages, are even more surprised at how much difference and contrariety there is in people's tastes. We are apt to call barbarous anything that departs widely from our own taste and viewpoint, but we soon find that others will condemn us in the same way, and even the most arrogant and self-satisfied people, when they find to their surprise that others with different tastes are equally sure of themselves, eventually become hesitant in this contest of sentiment to claim positively that they are right. So, Hume is basically saying here, what I already kind of stated earlier, that our standards are different. They're based on experience. And so obviously we're going to have a cultural bias. We're going to be accustomed to certain things and not accustomed to others. And this is no less true of morality than it is of aesthetics, okay, when we're talking about artistic tastes. He says this variety of taste, which is obvious at a casual glance, turns out on examination to be even greater in reality than in appearance. Men often differ about beauty and ugliness of all kinds, even when they talk in the same way, of what kind of things are beautiful and what kind of things are ugly. Every language contains some words that imply blame, others that imply praise, and all those who use that language must agree in how they apply them. All the voices are united in applauding elegance, propriety, simplicity, spirit in writing, and in blaming pomposity, affectation, coldness, and spurious glitter. But when critics get down to a particular detail, this seeming unanimity vanishes, and they turn out to have given very different meanings to their own words. So, his point here is that oftentimes, we use the word beautiful, it always means positive, right? So I had this quote here: one man's trash is another man's treasure. And I've got a picture of a guy here with a handful of mussels, these sea mussels that most of you in class are probably thinking, ugh, I wouldn't want one of those, although I think they're delicious, right? A little bit of steamed mussels and white wine sauce, magnifique. But yeah, so Hume's just pointing this out. I mean, look at this. We use the same language to describe the things that we like, but what we actually are referring to, the objects that we're referring to, often differ. So the words aren't what we're disputing over. Everybody loves beauty. Everybody loves virtue. What we, our idea of those, our opinion, our taste of those is what's going to determine the difference here. So again, these words like elegance, propriety, simplicity, spirit, and writing, these are always praise. These are always positive terms. However we translate these words in whatever language we use. Pomposity, affectation, coldness, spurious glitter. These are all things that we think are bad. If somebody's like real pompous and too bold, the writing's like over the top, it's like, what? Come on. Affectatious, it's just a little too try hard to get you to feel this emotion, real sappy or something, trying to make you feel sad, but it's really just kind of corny. Something cold, maybe the opposite of that, right? Something that lacks any emotion or any depth. And then stuff that's just, it's just all bells and whistles with no real depth or substance to it, right? These are all seen as critical, bad things for works of art to have. But what people mean by these is not always the same, right? Their meaning is not always the same. And I'm going to skip these two slides here because all he does, he really just elaborates more and more on this point. And we get into a lot of stuff about language, which I don't know if is that, I mean, it's interesting, I guess, but there's a lot more interesting stuff here going on. So, he says we're naturally, this is the next slide, we're naturally impelled to seek after a standard of taste, but some think it's not possible, right? Given this difference of opinions, not just about art, but about ethics, and that's kind of what I'm skipping, is all the stuff he says about ethics. Some say it's not possible. You can't come up with a universal standard of taste. There really is no standard of taste. And Hume's going to push back on that, which you might be surprised about, given all I've said so far. If he's an empiricist and what we like is just what pleases us, and what pleases us might differ between people, you might think there really is no standard of taste. He says it's natural, though, for us to seek one. It's natural for us to seek a standard of taste, a rule by which various sentiments of men can be reconciled, or at least a decision reached that confirms one sentiment and condemns another. But one philosophical position cuts off all hopes of success in such an attempt, maintaining that it's impossible for there ever to be a standard of taste. And this is kind of a common sense view. A lot of people, the old saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so and so there's a lot going for that view. But Hume, like I said, he's going to push back on that in just a moment. But first he starts by distinguishing between sentiments on the one hand, and then judgments on the other. When it comes to sentiments, the way I feel about something, he says those are always right. If I say I feel sad or happy, like Hume's not going to deny that. That's true. If I feel like that cake was too sweet, and you're like, no, it was just sweet enough. But he's going to say, no, you shouldn't argue about that. That's silly. It's too sweet for his taste, right? Your taste is your taste. So your taste is always right in that sense. But when it comes to what he calls judgments, these can be right or wrong. These can be correct or incorrect. So let's see if we can unpack what he means by this and what he's talking about. How can judgments be correct and incorrect, and how are they different from sentiments? He says there's a very wide difference between judgment and sentiment. All sentiment is right because sentiment doesn't refer to anything beyond itself and is always real whenever a man is conscious of it. But not all states of understanding are right because they refer to something beyond themselves, namely real matter of fact, and they don't always square with that. 1,000 men may have a different opinion about some one thing, but just exactly one of the opinions is true. And the only difficulty is to find out which one that is. As against that, 1,000 different sentiments aroused by some one object are all right, because no sentiment represents what is really in the object, and so no sentiment runs any risk of being false. Okay, when we get to Kant, you're going to see that there's a certain sense where Kant agrees with Hume here, but he would disagree that this is what we talk when we say something's beautiful, we're talking about something completely different. For Hume, he's like, look, if it pleases you and you think it's good, then I can't say that you're wrong about that. It pleased you. So for you, it's good. But when you're actually applying it to something external and saying that that thing is just absolute, that's when you're making a mistake, when you're making a judgment about it. There's something in the object that deserves or doesn't deserve approval. That's when a judgment comes in. But insofar as you feel a certain way, I mean, I can't doubt you. I can't take away that from you. You've got your feelings, and those are always correct. Yes, you feel the way you feel. This is uncontroversial. Kant would agree, but Kant would say, we'll see this next week. Kant would say, that's not really art. That's not beauty. That's not what we're talking about. That's simply satisfying. That's pleasure, right? And it's not the same thing. But for Hume, it pretty much is, right? What we mean by good, beautiful, these are what please us. So he says a sentiment does mark a certain conformity or relation between the object and the organs or faculties of the mind. So there's something in the object that conforms, you might say agrees with something in my organs, my sniff, my nose, my ears, my eyes, whatever, or my faculty of my mind, my sentiments. There's something out there that makes those feel good. There's a conformity. And so he says there's no chance of error there. Because if that conformity didn't exist, the sentiment wouldn't exist either. If there wasn't something in the chocolate cake that was sweet taste causing, namely sugar, then it wouldn't taste sweet to me. So, so there is something out there that's causing me to have my sentiment. There is something external and real. He says beauty is not a quality in things themselves. This is something I think that might not be Kantian. Again, we'll learn more about him later. But so the beauty is not in the actual object itself, but it's in the mind of the person perceiving it. It exists merely in the mind that contemplates them. And each mind perceives a different beauty. One person may even perceive ugliness where someone else senses beauty. And every individual ought to go along with his own sentiment without trying to regulate those of others. To look for what is really beautiful or really ugly is as pointless as trying to settle what is really sweet and what is really bitter. A single object may be both sweet to someone and bitter to someone else, depending on the condition of their taste buds. And the proverb rightly declares that it's pointless to dispute about taste. Okay, so he seems to be kind of emphasizing the original position. Okay, there is no standard of taste. It's everyone to themselves. Everyone's got their own judgment. Because all sentiments are different and they can never be wrong, then there's no standard of taste. At least that's what the argument tells us. But that seems to go against something else that's common sense to us, right? And it seems common sense. Yeah, sure. You like strawberry ice cream. I like chocolate. You know, what the heck? You know, I mean, I think you're crazy. I mean, strawberry's good. I get it. I like strawberry, but man, chocolate, you had to pick. Give me a break. It's got to be chocolate. Um, but then you think about other situations, right? Like, who would say that In-N-Out Burger is better than Whataburger? I mean, come on. I'm just kidding. I don't want to start a big fight here. I know that's a little bit more disputable, but who would think Taco Bell is better than like authentic Mexican food? That one is kind of like, I mean, maybe there's some people out there that like Taco Bell better than actual like, homemade, authentic, Mexican, taco made by mom or whatever, made by, your abuela, that's going to be better than the Taco Bell taco, right? I actually, every once in a while, I got a student who's like, "Oh, I like Taco Bell better." But we don't take them serious. We're like, "You're okay, sure, maybe you do like Taco Bell better than the taco I just got you at that badass taco truck across the street from my house, but like, you're crazy. If you like Taco Bell better than this, then you got no taste." So it seems like common sense is competing. It's like, on the one hand, we're like, everyone's got their taste, but then there's some other times where we're like, well, wait a minute, no, obviously some, authentic Mexican food is better than that like cheap fast food stuff. Looks like someone's in the chat box. I don't know, the quesarito is pretty good. Look, I get it. Like, I used to eat Taco Bell too when I was in high school. We would like, all of us would get together, we'd skip class and save money. We'd go buy cheap food at Taco Bell and spend the rest on other stuff. And, so like, I get it. Yeah, the quesarito can be good, especially after doing some other stuff, but it's still not as good as like the quesadilla at like a badass like Mexican restaurant. I don't know, man. I don't want to push this too much, but it's quite cheap. Yeah, the value is more important to taste for somebody. Yeah, but still, Hugh might agree, but that's not an aesthetic concern. That's an economic concern. He'd say, so maybe like economically, sure, the Taco Bell is more, although darn it, like, maybe it's because the neighborhood I live in, I live over here in the second, Barrio Secunda, it's like there's a freaking taco stand on every corner practically. So it's pretty much as cheap as Taco Bell, pretty close. So, but I get it. But he would say, yeah, that's obviously like there are other values besides aesthetic values, but as far as just the flavor and the taste, one would be better than another. Although I guess I'm getting a little pushback, so I guess I'll stop. But let me read his quote. Here he explains it. He says, although this axiom by turning into a proverb, right? Everyone's got their own taste, leave them alone. Although this axiom by turning into a proverb seems to have gained the support of common sense, there's certainly a kind of common sense that opposes it, or at least serves to modify and restrain it. Someone who asserted an equality of genius and elegance between Ogilvy and Milton, or between Bunyan and Addison, would be thought to be defending something as extravagant as declaring a molehill to be as high as a Matterhorn, or a pond as wide as the Atlantic. Perhaps there are people who prefer Ogilvy and Bunyan, but no one pays attention to such taste. And we don't hesitate to say that the sentiment of these purported critics is absurd and ridiculous. In that context, the principle of the natural equality of all taste is totally forgotten. We admit it on some occasions where the objects seem nearly equal, but it seems like an extravagant paradox, or rather an obvious absurdity, when it's applied to objects that are so disproportionate to one another. So yeah, I guess like if you're saying, like my example earlier, strawberry ice cream versus chocolate ice cream, that's kind of similar, but I think something like, to me, maybe I'm wrong, but the Taco Bell authentic Mexican food example I thought was a good one, but maybe it's not. But maybe like, okay, a frozen burrito that you got at a gas station versus like any other like homemade fresh burrito. Come on, you like who likes a frozen burrito in a microwave better than that? I mean, that's pretty obvious.
Professor?
Yes, yeah.
Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah,
I just want to ask a question. Couldn't it be said that like the objective opinions or like the objective facts of the differentiation between quality could just be derived by aggregating all sentiments?
That's what he's going to do. He doesn't quite say it that way, but that's kind of what he's going to do.
Okay, because that's like what I was getting at. Because like he presents it like this, and like I was I was just wondering, like, how do we know? And I guess
Yeah, there's a little more to it. I don't think he develops it that well, honestly. That was going to be one of my criticisms of him, is that he kind of says that. He doesn't use the word aggregate, but that's pretty much what he says. He's like, what are the things that are good are kind of the things that most people sort of, it's almost like a democratic thing, you know. It's like the works of art that stand the test of time, that please most people under most conditions, those are the things that are the best. Yeah. So he'll elaborate a little bit on it, but that's the basic point. Yeah.
but wouldn't that mean that like sentiments are ultimately superior to judgments in a sense?
Not exactly, but I think maybe in this context, I would say like in this context, your judgment of taste is based upon, if you have a good judgment of taste, ultimately for Hume, you have if you have a good judgment of taste, it's because your sentiments, or actually you're sensitive, you're feeling, you're very good at perceiving subtle differences and subtle distinctions. So you know you have a what's the term, a sophisticated palate, pretty much, which can be developed, he thinks, but that's basically it. And he's going to argue, and this is another thing that might be controversial. We'll get to it eventually, probably not till towards the end. It's kind of close to the end of the article, but he's going to say that tastes don't really change as much as scientific views. He says the way we look at the world has changed more drastically than like the great works of art. We still look at Homer, and we read Homer, and we read the Iliad and the Odyssey and all these great works of literature from the classical age, but nobody studies Aristotle's biology for science. You know, they might read the biology just because it's interesting to know, but you know, he would say that standards of beauty actually stand the test of time. There are fads that come and go, sure, but ultimately the great works of art will always stand the test of time. And you know, that's the basic argument. But we're going to come back to it. So let's put up just a quick pin on that. But that you're looking ahead. You're basically, you see where he's going with this. But yeah, back to the point. He's like, okay, so on one hand, yeah, you've got your taste, I've got my taste. I'm not going to argue. You like this band better than the other band. You know, it's just a matter of taste. So there's this idea that there's a natural equality of taste, and that principle is sort of common sense, but it also is not common sense because, I've got this picture here of Beyonce with all her Grammys, stacked up. I mean, obviously Beyonce has a better singing voice than that drunk guy slurring into the microphone at karaoke night. I mean, I honestly, this might get me a bit of pushback. I'm almost hesitant to say it. I would probably rather go watch the drunk blind guy because I'm just not a big fan of Beyonce. But I still agree with the point. She's a way better singer than the drunk dude. I just think that guy's kind of funny and entertaining. Although, I don't know. I've been in situations like that, and they're really annoying and obnoxious, and I just want to leave. But, it could be entertaining and amusing, but it wouldn't be because he has a good voice or because he's like a talented person. It's a spectacle. It's not an aesthetic or artistic thing. So it's like, if I was in the mood for something comical, I might want to watch the drunk guy, but no one would say that he's like the better singer. Obviously Beyonce has a better voice. Even if you don't really like her music that much, you're not really into her music, she's just got a better singing voice than this this drunk dude just slurring into the microphone. So how do we determine, the difference? And is there really one? How do we somehow resolve this paradox? Hassan, you pretty much got right to it. That the general idea is there's a convention that is established through, consensus, basically. You talked about like an aggregate of sentiments. That's kind of a good way to put it. All of our sentiments come together and coalesce and seem to be moved aesthetically by similar things. There's variations and people's taste will change, but the greatest works of art will always endure. He says, obviously, none of the rules of composition are fixed by a priori reasoning. Let me actually back up and read that first line. So the rules of composition, we were talking about Aristotle last week, and he gave us all these rules. How are you supposed to write tragedy? What kind of characters are you supposed to have in it? How are the events supposed to take place? How do you set up the plot? He was very exact, I mean, not super precise, but he had very clear rules, and Hume pushes back on it because he says that rules are not based on a priori reasoning, they're based on experience. This again points back to his empiricism. What is a priori or a priori reasoning? What is that? Well, that yeah, Hassan, are you I saw you jump in there with your video. Are you familiar with the term? What does a priori mean? Anybody else? I can explain it pretty quick, but
I think it means you figure something out without experiencing it.
right, exactly. Yeah, so if someone says deductive, and I would say that's controversial, but most would agree, yes, deductive reasoning is a priori. If it's deductive, it's a priori. If it's a priori, is it deductive? That's another story, and I don't want to get into it. But so yeah, the way Hassan put it, you don't need experience to know that it's true. For David Hume, there isn't a lot of reasoning that would be a priori. For David Hume, it's pretty much limited to mathematical reasoning, geometrical reasoning, and things like this, arithmetic, as he puts it, and geometry. So, 2 plus 2 equals 4. In order to know that, you don't need to go and consult the world around you. You just have to understand what it means to say that 2 plus 2 equals 4. To know that a triangle has 3 angles on the inside that add up to 2 right angles, you don't need to look at the world around you and experience that. You just have to think about triangles and the property of triangles, and just by reflecting on it, you understand it a priori, as opposed to the opposite. And this is a term I don't think that, surprisingly, it doesn't pop up in David Hume's article, but it'll pop up in Kant, so I'm going to give it to you anyway right now. It's a posteriori, so that would be the opposite. So if something is if it's known or reasoned about a posteriori, then it's based on experience. Let me type out, I'll spell it for you. It's in the chat box if you need the spelling. So all of our tastes and even rules of composition, what works and what doesn't work in a play or a movie or a book, these are all based on experience. They're not based on some universal principle of, like some mathematical principle. They're not a priori rules. They're based on what pleases and what doesn't please. That's the basis of it for David Hume. And this is another, you're going to see when we get to Kant, this is another path where they definitely diverge. For Kant would say something similar. Art is not so cut and dry. It doesn't have these cut and dry rules, but yet the experience of art has some a priori elements. It gets complicated when we get to Kant, but I'm giving you sort of a little bit of a preview, a little warning here. Kant, by the way, is probably the most difficult philosopher I think we're going to study this semester, so it helps to plant a few seeds in your brain, so when we get there, it's not so freaking overwhelming, right? I think Hume is a lot more straightforward with what he's saying here. When you get to the Kant reading, you're going to be like, what the heck? So actually, I hope today we have a little bit of time at the end of class to at least talk about Kant, so you'll be prepared for the reading, because yeah, it's not an easy ride, that's for sure. But yeah, so the rules of composition, how, what works, what doesn't, this is based on not a priori reasoning, but on experience, he says. Obviously, none of the rules of composition are fixed by a priori reasoning, and they can't be regarded as abstract conclusions that the understanding has arrived at by studying the relations between ideas that are eternal and unchanging, like the idea of a circle or whatever. They're not some Platonic ideal of beauty, going back to Plato. They're based on the same thing that all the practical sciences are based on: experience. All they are is general observations about what has been found universally in all countries and at all times to please. So that's it. That's his basic formula. All that italicized stuff there. What is good? What is bad when it comes to art? What do we mean by that? Well, sometimes we just mean our own personal view. When we're talking about general standards, what we're talking about are general observations about what has been found universally in all countries and at all times to please. And so those are the great works of art. Those are the standards by which other works of art are judged. So they're basically based on convention. And convention is based on what pleases. So he's assuming that there's some, even though each of us are unique, we're all human beings, and we all have similar biological, constructions, for lack of a better word, right? We have a similar way our bodies are organized. We all have brains and guts and all this stuff. And so we are hardwired, perhaps you could say, or we're naturally inclined to like sweet stuff and to like proportionate stuff. And that's why we call it beautiful. If we were another type of animal, or we were another type of organism, perhaps we would have a different aesthetic, and we would think other things are beautiful. He says many of the beauties of poetry and even of eloquence are based on falsehood and fiction, on exaggerations, metaphors, and bending words from their natural meanings. To check the imagination's outbursts and to reduce every expression to geometrical truth and exactness would be utterly contrary to the laws of criticism, because it would produce a work of a kind that universal experience has shown to be the most insipid and disagreeable. So I had this question: is he attacking Plato here? Is he attacking Aristotle? Maybe not. Maybe he's attacking a lot of other aesthetic theory that preceded him. Any aesthetic theory, I think, that tries to base what's good or right in a work of art bases it on these exact, precise, mathematical rules. Hume is arguing doesn't really get how art works. Art is the product of genius, of inspiration, and what will please you can't know a priori. You can't know till after it's completed. So, somebody might be making a work of art that his teacher's looking over his shoulder, and that's not going to work. That's not the right way, and people aren't going to like your work of art, and that's just wrong. And it's like, well, you don't know that yet. Wait till I'm finished, and let's see. Let's see the kind of response it gets. And so I think, Hume is pushing back on this very formulaic approach to art and art criticism. This is something I would say he shares with Kant, maybe for different reasons, but they both seem to think that this is the case. Schopenhauer as well, when we get to him, you're going to see they want to push back on this idea that art is, our beauty itself is adhering to strict rules that are unchanging and eternal. Although now that I say it, I'm thinking maybe Schopenhauer, it's a little bit more complicated. But, oh, geez, I just skipped a little bit there at the bottom. What does that say? So in any event, he's opposed to this rigid, calculated approach to art. Okay, it's not in keeping with our experience, how we experience art. Sometimes art that breaks the rules, that does things that are kind of outside our expectations of what will follow, will actually be really good and give us this really good aesthetic experience. So will actually please us despite what we might predict. So we can't know till after it happens, right? It's all known through experience, not known a priori. Okay, so he says, although poetry can never submit to exact truth, it must be confined by rules of art that are revealed to the author either by his genius or by observation. I had this quote from Schopenhauer. I just mentioned him a moment ago. Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. So genius is someone who's able to see something no one else can see and bring it forth, point it out to everybody, and they're like, oh, wow. And from that point on, now it becomes a part of the repertoire. Now it's a part of aesthetic experience that's pleasurable and good. Now it becomes a part of our standard of taste, this universal standard of taste. So it's always based on experience, and there's no way of knowing what experience is going to provide us with and how we're going to react to it until it happens. If some negligent or irregular writers have given pleasure, they've done so in spite of their transgressions of rule or order, not because of them. Their work has had other beauties that would be approved by sound criticism, and the force of these beauties gives our minds a satisfaction that is greater than our distance for the blemish, our distaste for the blemishes, and thus overpowers our censure. So rules are given either by genius or observation, and we allow things that seem to be transgressions of our normal expectation. We might expect, and I know most of you probably aren't huge classical music fans, but I know a lot of the chord progressions in Beethoven were like this, and you hear them today and you're like, yeah, Beethoven, you're so familiar with Beethoven's music, even if you don't know you probably know dun 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 dun. You know the fifth, you know all that stuff. But a lot of these chord progressions were very what's the word I'm looking for, unconventional at the time, and they weren't, it was sort of the 1-4-5, 1-4-5, or some variation of that chord progression. And Beethoven he would do things intentionally to set up an expectation and then kind of throw you something else. And you would expect a cadence or a pause in the music, and it would just continue to flow. And so he liked to trick his listeners like that. It doesn't really quite work anymore because it's become part of our, modern music takes advantage of a lot of his insights now. But at the time, it was, I'm sure some more conventional composers during his time thought he was nuts and that he was just too wild, little rebel Beethoven, Now we're like, yeah, Beethoven. Right? Most of us, I love it, but some of y'all probably go to sleep listening to Beethoven. If our pleasure really did arise from the parts of the poem that we call faults, this would be no objection to criticism in general. In other words, it wouldn't be an objection to having some rules of criticism under which some things are to be judged as faulty. So he's actually going to come up with something like this later on in the article, some standard of judgment. How do we judge something good or bad? How do we become good critics? How do we know we're a good critic? And that sort of thing. So he says that, so there will be some rules, but we also have to keep this in mind, that rules are pretty flighty, and they're rough and they're rough, not rough and ready. What's the word I'm looking for? Sort of rough shot, and they're malleable. They change. So if there are these general rules of criticism, and a new work of art is successful, despite the fact that it seems to violate those rules, he says it wouldn't be an objection to having some rules. It would be an objection only to the particular rules of criticism that imply that the passages in question are faulty, thus representing them as universally blamable. So, maybe like last class, I was talking about the Quentin Tarantino movies, Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs, where he seems to completely ignore the normal sequence of the plot. The beginning, middle, and end whole thing, and you get this non-linear narrative where the movie starts at the end, and you get all these jumbled things. And so, but it works. At least I think it works. I think Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs are great films. And so this would be an example, I think, what he's talking about. Maybe that rule was not quite a good rule. That's, it doesn't mean that there are no rules, but that's just not a good one. So the rules are universally blamable, or at least a transgression of them is not universally blamable. If the passages in question are found to please, they can't be faulty. However surprising and inexplicable is the pleasure they produce. So if they please us aesthetically, then exceptions are not faulty. They expose the faultiness again of these, this idea that rules are somehow universal or a priori as they apply to art. So he says, although the general rules of art are based purely on experience, on observation of the common sentiments of human nature, we mustn't imagine on every occasion that the feelings of men will square with these rules. Those finer emotions of the mind are very tender and delicate, and they won't come smoothly and precisely into play according to their general and established principles, unless many circumstances are in their favor. If we are to judge concerning the universal beauty of some work of art, we need, and he lists these three things, we need perfect serenity of mind, a gathering together of our thoughts, and proper attention to the work of art. This is the beginning, I think, of what really gets culminated in Kant's philosophy, but it's a focus on the spectator in aesthetic theory. You could argue that Plato and Aristotle did not focus on the spectator, the person seeing and enjoying the art, but they focused more on the art itself and the people making the art, the artist, and the process of creation and that sort of thing. Aristotle talking about how to write a play and the goal of the play and the telos of the play, and Plato talking about what the work of art represents and how it's a copy of a copy and all these sort of things. So, but with Hume and definitely with Kant is a big proponent of this, is focusing on how the individual experiences beauty, how the individual experiences works of art, what that entails, what that means, and the proper way to do it. This is a key for Kant for sure, and it seems to be a big key for Hume here. So he's saying if you're going to enjoy art and be a good critic and understand the rules, you have to enjoy the art properly. You have to enjoy it in this very detached sort of way. Perfect serenity of the mind. Your mind can't be distracted by other things. You have to focus on that work. You can't be texting your friend and you know, looking at the headlines on the news channel and then enjoying the music at the same time, because then the music's just going to be in the background. You have to be, you know, just relaxed and just focusing on the beautiful sounds of the music. You have to gather your thoughts, okay? And again, that's going to probably going to be correlated with the first. You have to gather your thoughts together. Okay, like, okay, what am I listening to here? How is this different from other compositions? And again, this entails a proper attention to the work of art. He says, so art can only work, can only please us under the right conditions: serenity, gathering of thoughts, and proper attention to the work. If any of these is lacking, our test won't be valid and we'll be unable to reach a conclusion, or anyway, the relation that nature has placed between the form of the work and the sentiment of the observer will be more obscure. And tracing it out and recognizing it will rather require greater precision. So you could argue that Hume is a naturalist. That word naturalist, by the way, it has meanings outside of philosophy that are little, but by naturalist, that everything is understood through nature, part of nature. I wouldn't say Hume was a straight up naturalist, but he seems to be a naturalist here with regards to aesthetic theory. That, you know, as he puts it, the relation that nature has placed between the form of the work and the sentiment of the observer. So, as I was saying earlier, naturally humans are designed, our tongues have taste buds that are, you know, your tongue is different from my tongue. I mean, you might like spicier food than me. Probably not. I like it pretty spicy, but maybe. You know, I've met my match. I've met some people that were like, whoa, they take that Dave's Insanity sauce and they pour it on their taco like it's you know, just a little salad dressing or something. But you know, obviously there's differences, but we all have a human tongue. I'm assuming there's no aliens here on the Zoom call. None of the reptilian elite are here. Okay, good. So we all have human tongues, and so nature has placed this relationship between our human tongue and sweet tasting things. But if any conditions are not met, it will obscure that relationship. So we have to be under the proper conditions to properly appreciate things. This reminds me, I don't know why, but I'm thinking of, has anybody in here ever read the story by Franz Kafka, The Metamorphosis? I'm looking in the, yeah, just
I've heard of it.
you've heard of it. Okay. So it's a story about this guy, this poor young man who, he wakes up one morning and he realizes that he's turned into a cockroach, or it just says a bug. But it's usually like when you see people, like the artist will do an homage to Kafka and it'll be like just this giant cockroach. And that's kind of how he describes it. And poor oh, what's his name? I forgot the name of the character. Samza or Sam or I don't know, whatever. But the guy, the poor Gregor, that's a guy's name, Gregor. He turns into a freaking cockroach and he's like freaking out, and his family's freaking out. They don't know it's him for a while, and eventually the sister finds out that it's his brother, that's her brother, and she starts feeling sorry for him, and so she wants to feed him some food, and so she's like, she gets him his favorite meal, and she cooks him, like, I forgot what it was, you know, like some his favorite bread and some soup or something like that, and puts it in the room. The parents are all freaked out about this. They don't even want to come near this giant cockroach, but the sister's like, that's Gregor, that's my brother, you know, I know it's him, you know. So she tries to feed the cockroach, and Gregor, the story's told from his perspective, so you kind of get his, you know, how he's experiencing the world as this cockroach. And he talks about how the food just was like, he didn't want it. He was like, it just, he was excited when he first saw it because he was really hungry. They hadn't fed him for a while. So he jumps up to it, he's like, but then she gets a bunch of like rotten fruit and like a stale piece of cheese or something like that, and just throws it on the floor. And he, like, for some reason, is like, it was the most palatable, like, it was delicious, you know. I wanted this rotten, disgusting food. And so I guess it's because his organism has changed. So for me, I think if you wanted to be a David Hume and maintain a David Hume aesthetics, a theory of aesthetics, you would have to get into biology. Like you'd have to get into um, the different structures of the different organisms, so like if I'm a cockroach, rotten smelly fruit would be like the most delicious food in the world, but like the fresh produce that you got like straight from the farmer's market would be disgusting, if you were a cockroach. So like cockroach aesthetics would be different from human aesthetics, I suppose. But even as a human, right? Even as a human, we will be in a condition or a state in which we aren't able to properly enjoy whatever the object of aesthetic enjoyment is. So we have to have a precise and sort of unobscure relation between the object and the person, the observer. And so he says our best way of discovering its influence, in other words, discovering what works of art please the discriminating mind, we will be not to investigate the operation of each particular beauty, but rather to attend to which works of art have been admired through the centuries, surviving all the caprices of modes and fashion, all the mistakes of ignorance and envy. So obviously he's mentioning here that mode and fashion, ignorance and envy, a lot of these are things that get in the way and obscure our appreciation of works of art. If we're envious of somebody, maybe we're an artist ourselves and we see some other artist and we're jealous of them because they're famous and we're like, they're not that good. And it's like, you're just biased. You just don't like that guy. He is good or she is good, right? So, and also things are it's just a fad. I mean, I don't know what's popular now. I mean, I can't stand top 40 music, so I avoid the radio like the plague. But I remember when I was a kid, the awful music that was popular, none of it's popular now. None of it. I can't think of one thing that was, well, some. I'm trying to, I mean, but does anybody here listen to Criss Cross or Vanilla Ice or MC Hammer? Anybody a fan of those bands or musicians or whatever you want to call them? No, they were huge when I was in middle school. They were huge. MC Hammer was huge, man. He was like, everywhere you went, there's like a MC Hammer cardboard cutout, okay? I wonder how many of those albums are just sitting in dustbins right now, So, so those obviously, I don't know, maybe 100 years from now, MC Hammer records will like be reemerged as these great works of art and I'll be, eating my words, but I somehow doubt that's the case. By the way, if I make fun of something you like, don't take it personal, please. I like a lot of stuff that you probably would hate. In fact, most of the stuff I listen to, you guys would be like, what the heck? Professor Ross is weird. You listen to some weird music. So yeah, don't take it personal. I have some pretty peculiar taste. But Hume is saying here, no, like great works of art, they're out there. There is such a thing as a good work of art and a bad work of art, even though it's something based on experience. There are things that generally please us, that generally are good. Of course, there might be a few exceptions, a few people that don't like sweets and they don't like savory or they don't like, but in general, he's just making kind of a general claim, with few exceptions. So art that stands the test of time, he says, can be more confidently asserted to adhere to these standards of beauty that are established ultimately through our sentiments via experience. The same Homer who pleased people at Athens and Rome 2,000 years ago is still admired today in Paris and in London. All the changes of climate, government, religion, and language haven't been able to obscure his glory. Authority or prejudice may create a temporary fashion in favor of a bad poet or orator, but his reputation won't ever be lasting or general. When his compositions are examined by posterity or by foreigners, the enchantment disappears and his faults appear in their true colors. It is different with the real genius. The longer his works endure and the more widely they're spread, the more sincere is the admiration that he meets with. So again, they stand the test of time. And then there's like personal gripes. I don't know if anybody in here has ever seen the movie Amadeus, but it came out in the movie theaters when I was like a little kid. And I remember when it came out. It was really popular. But Amadeus is a movie about the life of Mozart, and it's highly fictional. It's not really, I think he did know Salieri, but in the movie they make this other composer, Salieri, they make him out to be like his arch nemesis. And Mozart is supposed to be like this really like kind of naive but musical genius, and he's not really aware that Salieri hates his guts so much. But again, Salieri hates his guts, and honestly, though, maybe this isn't really the best example of what Hume's talking about here, because I think ultimately Salieri in the movie, he knows that Mozart is better than him. Like he knows that that Mozart's a better composer, but he like can't stand the fact that he's got all the, and he wants to be like him, you know, and he's got this envy. So maybe this is not the best example, but this will happen. Well, you know, haters gonna hate, you know, like they're gonna hate on you because, you know, you're just better than them. You're just a better writer or a better artist or whatever. So that's something he brings up: envy and jealousy. Right? He says these play too large a part in a narrow circle. Another thing, right? If you personally know I know when I talk to my friends about philosophy, and when I talk to them about anything that I study and have a freaking degree in, they don't really seem to think I have that much authority on it. Like they're always, well, I saw a YouTube video. Whereas like, I don't get that from my students, you know what I mean? So it's sort of, I'm not saying I'm like some brilliant genius, but it's like, they've known me a little bit longer, and, you know, they've seen me, you know, in my sort of more loose party mode or whatever. So it's hard for them to like respect me as some like professorial authority on anything. You know, even though I freaking am, like, I'm sorry, like I know more about Plato than you do. Don't argue about Plato's theory of forms because you saw a 5-minute video on YouTube by somebody who also doesn't know. So it's, you know, I get this, you know, and I'm sure it happens with art. You know, it's like you have a friend, and that, to me, that's I would say that's a sign of being a bad friend, man. Like you're not really a friend. If you're hating on someone and you're envious of them because they're doing something good, and are you really a friend? I don't think so. You know, I've come to sort of think this, you know, that the true friend would want you might be like, dang, you know, I wish I could have that talent. But if you really like that person, you're gonna be like, cool, man, that's badass that you're doing good and you're a successful artist or whatever. You know, I have a friend, I have to take her word for this. I don't know, but her best buddy, she says it's her best friend. And she says that, I'm just going to call her Kelly. Okay, I'm making up a name, right? My buddy Kelly, she says that her friend, I was about to say her actual name. Let me make up another one. Her friend's name is April. Okay, so Kelly and April. And every time that my friend Kelly is in a happy relationship and doing well for herself, her best friend April, who lives in another city, doesn't call her, doesn't talk to her. Like, she'll never hear from her. And I have a theory. I'm like, man, I don't know if your best friend is really your best friend. It seems like whenever things are going well for you, she doesn't want to hear about it. And I think it's because she's in a very unhappy marriage. So it's like jealousy sort of thing, right? So this can get in the way of our appreciation for art if it's maybe someone we don't like personally, maybe even we don't know them. You know, I kind of had the opposite thing happen to me with Pitbull. I'm sure you guys have heard of Pitbull. I did not like that guy. I could not stand him. They used to play his music. I mean, I have a gym at my house now, but I used to go to the gym, and I don't like wearing earbuds, so I had to listen to whatever crap music they were playing in the gym. And that's how I became familiar with Pitbull. And I could not stand, this guy's music just sucks. I'm sorry if you like him. I mean, apologies, but I just couldn't. And I started hating the guy. I was like, he's so annoying. He's so stupid. But then I saw him on an interview, and he was the sweetest, like nicest guy. Like, he's like impossible to hate. I mean, maybe it was just the day I saw him on. Maybe he's on another interview or he's a jerk. But he's such a charming guy. I'm just like, you know what, Pitbull, you're all right. You know, I'm not a fan of your music, but, you know, so I kind of had the opposite experience, you know. Mr. Worldwide, is that what he calls himself? Let's see in the chat box there. But anyway, yeah, I'm glad I saw that interview because I had an unhealthy dislike for the guy. I'm glad I saw him because it, you know, humanized him. You know, I was like, you know, Travis, you need to like get over it. You know, yeah, crappy music's out there. You don't like it, whatever. But it's not just this. What else gets in the way of us being able to appreciate art? Sometimes it's not our fault. It's not our character flaws. that prevent us from seeing good art. Sometimes it's our state. You know, if it's tied to our experience and our senses are tied to our body and our physical, you know, our organism, then it would stand to reason that sometimes if we're not in a very healthy state, we're not going to be able to appreciate. I mean, maybe you've been sick before and you tried to eat some food to comfort you. You know, you're like, man, I'm sick, I'm going to go eat some comfort food, and the food didn't have quite as robust a flavor. Your taste buds were kind of weakened. So he talks about these sort of states as well, that these aren't the best states to be in if you're going to be a good critic, if you're going to be a good spectator of art and really have good taste. He says, we find that amidst all the variety and caprice of taste, there are general sources of approval and disapproval whose influence a careful eye can detect in all operations of the mind. Because of the original structure of the human constitution, some particular forms or qualities are apt to please and others to displease. And if they fail of their effect in any particular instance, it is from an apparent defect or imperfection in the organ. So it's kind of ties back to the example I was giving earlier about the Kafka story. You know, when Gregor was a human, he liked that meal that his sister had prepared for him. But when he was a cockroach, right, he was a different organism in a certain sense. So he's going to like rotten cheese. But even we go through changes, even though we're all, I mean, I don't think anybody in here has ever turned into a giant bug. I sure hope not. If you had, I'd like to hear about it after class. But we're all human, but we've been sick before, or we've been in a state where we're kind of sluggish, and that is obviously going to affect our senses and our sensibility, or what he calls our sentiments. So a man in a fever wouldn't insist that his palate was a good judge of flavors. Someone suffering from jaundice wouldn't claim to give a verdict regarding colors. For each creature, there is a sound state and a defective state, and only the sound state can be supposed to give a true standard of taste and sentiment. So, pleasure, he says, is not felt or perceived equally in every individual. So even when we're in our healthiest state, let's say that I'm not sick and I'm feeling fine. I'm, my mind is not confused or something like this. He's going to say that even in all our healthiest states, some people are better than others. Some people are better than others at tasting things, at the subtleties. You know, what do they call them? Oh, the sommelier, the wine sommelier. Anybody know what's a sommelier? Anybody familiar with that in the wine world? No one's ever heard of a sommelier? I thought that was becoming like real popular. All these people like, I want to be a sommelier. It's like
you have to take a test and go before a panel of judges, I think, and then it's like really, really difficult.
Yeah, but what are they tested on though? Do you know what they test them on? Dude, there's a lot of stuff. Like, well, they make them, okay, so they test them on wine. So you have to know, like, you have to blindfold them, and they taste the wine, and they have to know, like, what grape it is, what year, generally. They don't have to be, like, exact, but within a certain range. Like, what the terroir, like, what kind of soil that it was grown in and all this stuff. So, and there's different levels, you know. But, yeah, so, like, that would be someone who has, like, very refined tastes. And so he says, there are some objects, because of the natural structure of the mind, they are naturally apt to give pleasure. But just because this is the case, it can't be expected that the pleasure will be equally felt in every individual. Particular incidents and situations occur that either throw a false light on the objects or block the true light from conveying to the imagination the appropriate sentiment and perception. Yeah, this kind of, I don't know why I thought of this, but I'm thinking, I can't even think of a particular example, but I don't know, maybe you've had this happen to you before where you took your friend to go somewhere eating that you liked and you went there and it sucked that day. Like, you're like, man, this place is usually good, but they really screwed up the lasagna was overcooked today or whatever, or they burnt the pizza or whatever, like, and you're like, man, it's not fair. We got to come back on a better day. Like, it was too, this is what I don't get. I used to work restaurants a lot, and you would think that the opposite is the case, but they've done studies on this, the more crowded that a restaurant is, the more people go to it, the more people want to go to it. I'm the opposite, man. If I see a place that's crowded, I'm like, man, I'm going to come back later, like at 3 o'clock after the lunch rush is over or something like this. I guess that might be changed a bit now since COVID-19 is a thing, right? But in general, yes, Summer, you got your hand raised. You want to jump in and say something? A question, comment? I think it's awkward to be in a restaurant by yourself. Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't feel that way, but I kind of see that, you know. I mean, I had a job where I was driving around the city all day. So when I ate lunch, I just had to eat lunch by myself. So I guess I'm kind of used to it. But
Professor,
yeah.
couldn't like people wanting to go to a crowded restaurant just be them using their inductive reasoning? Like, couldn't you say,
It's
well, if you got,
popular, it must be good.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, by that argument, McDonald's is like the finest cuisine in the
Yeah.
universe. But
It's not a good argument, probably, but yeah, I see. Yeah, what is it? I don't understand. I'm sorry if you like it, but I understand why there's so many Applebee's and so many Chili's in the United States. I don't get it. Like, what is the appeal to bland, like pre-packaged food? I don't understand. But everybody's like, well, Chili's got good burgers. Like, yeah, but are they as good as the burger joint, or like, you know, or even Whataburger, or like the M&M burger right down the street from my house? Like, I mean, you know, it's not M&M's like the candy. It's just I don't know why they call it M&M Burger, but that's the name of the place. But it's one of my favorite spots. But yeah, but I think I misunderstood a comment earlier. I don't want to be in a restaurant by myself. I was thinking like eating alone. But yeah, what you meant is I don't want to be the only one in there. It's like no one's eating here. It must be like really bad food or not safe or something like that. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, I don't want it to be completely. Yeah, there's like dust on the tables and like tumbleweeds like flying through the dining room. Yeah, I definitely don't want that situation. But yeah, I guess you're right. If I see it's popular, like what's that donut place over there on Washington, the Voodoo Donut? I still haven't tried it, man, because every time I drive by there, there's a line out the door, and you know I try to avoid donuts anyway, man, because they just sugar totally messes me up. Like that much sugar all at once. But he says that yeah, obviously like some people like have a more discerning taste than others. And he says one obvious cause for many people's not feeling the appropriate sentiment is their lack of delicacy. So it's not always some external thing. Sometimes it's your lack of delicacy, as he puts it. Um, he says everyone claims to have this delicacy, everyone talks about it, and they want to reduce every kind of taste or sentiment to its standard, but not everyone has it. And I love this little anecdote that he uses from the Cervantes, Don Quixote. If you ever read Don Quixote, I've never read it, honestly. It's on my bookshelf. One day. I think it's the first novel ever. You know, it's like the first modern novel where somebody actually wrote a long story but it's supposed to be hilarious. But Don Quixote, there's been tons of adaptations of it. Here's a statue of Don Quixote's sidekick, Sancho Panza. And there's a scene in Don Quixote where Sancho Panza, he's talking about his family, his kin, and how his kinfolk had good taste, how they were very discerning. And he tells the story of this wine jug. They're all drinking wine out of this jug, this group of people. And so, Sancho Panza is not like really high class. He's a kind of a servile person. And so the people his family are sort of drinking with are a little bit upper class. And they're like, this is the finest wine in the valley. It's the best wine in all of Spain and all this stuff. And Sancho Panza's kinsmen are like, it kind of tastes like leather. And they're like, it does not taste like leather. It's the finest wine of all Spain. And the other kinsman's like, it kind of tastes like metal. And they're like, it does not taste like metal. It's the finest wine of Spain, And they finally get to the bottom of the bottle, and there's a metal key with a leather satchel on it at the bottom of the wine jug. And so Sancho Panza's kinsfolk, his kinsmen, they had good taste. They could tell that subtle leather flavor, they could taste the flavor of the key or the leather in the wine. And all the other people sitting around, they were prejudiced, right? Because they're like, this is the wine that my family made, and this is the wine of my home country. It's the best of all, It's sort of, I don't know. I kind of get pissed off at my landlord because he hires some contractors that I don't think do that good of a job. But every time I do the work, he is so nitpicky about it. He's like, "You missed a spot there. You did this," and I'm like, "Look at your guys. They smeared this all over the." No, it's great. It's great work. Look how great this is. And I'm like, "You're just saying that because it's your guys. You know, it's like you're biased, man. I'm sorry, but I'm a better painter than they are. At least I care more about it. Whatever." But so for Hume, he's like, no, there is something to this. There are some people that have more discerning taste, that have more delicacy of imagination, as he puts it. And that's what he says is required to be a good judge of beauty or taste in general. You have to be discerning and refined. He says, sweet and bitter are not qualities in objects, but belong entirely to the external sentiments of the taster. It is even more certain that beauty and deformity are not qualities in objects, but belong entirely to the internal sentiments of readers, viewers, or hearers. So is all beauty or sentiment, is all taste, is it all of the beholder? Is that the case? It's complicated, right? He says it has to be accepted that certain qualities that are in objects are they're fitted by nature to produce those particular feelings, right? Sweet generally is something that people like. If something has sweetness to it, you want to eat more of it. If it's salty, you want to eat more of it, and that sort of thing. And that's just the way nature has designed us. But he says something in the object does tend to produce uniform effects. But sometimes, though, the thing is, and this is where the delicacy of taste comes in, sometimes these are very minute, they're very small, like the hint of metal in the wine, the hint of leather in the wine jug in the Don Quixote story. Or sometimes they're obscured by other elements. I guess that would also be the Don Quixote story, right? The wine overpowers the flavor of the leather and the metal, but because Sancho Panza's kinsmen they have good taste, they can taste it, they're able to taste it all the little aspects of the flavor, all the hints. He says, where the organs are, one, so finely tuned that nothing escapes them, and at the same time so exact that they perceive every ingredient in the mixture, that is what we call delicacy of taste. Whether we use the phrase in its literal sense, as in tasting wine, or in its metaphorical sense, as in tasting works of art. So whether you're talking about, Sancho Panza's kinsfolk drinking wine, or somebody listening to music and hearing subtle details in the music that others don't see. Oh, did you hear that the little melody in the background? That's really subtle, but it's nice. Oh, I didn't catch that. Let me hear it again. Could you rewind it? Rewind it, whatever, play it back, replay. So someone who has delicacy of taste can perceive all of these elements, even regardless of impediments, regardless of all this stuff. Says the general rules of beauty are useful. Sorry, I got a bunch of stuff in my way here. I gotta move. The general rules of beauty are useful because they're based on established models and on the observation of what qualities please or displease when they are presented, one, on their own, and two, in a high degree. And if someone who encounters those qualities in a small degree and as aspects of a complex composition, if his organs aren't affected with a sensible delight or uneasiness, we regard him as having no claim to delicacy of taste. To produce these general rules or well-tested patterns of composition is like finding the key with the leather thong in Sancho Panza's story. The key with the thong justified the verdict of Sancho Panza's two kinsmen and confounded the would-be judges of wine who laughed at them. Even if the cask had never been emptied, it would still have been the case that the taste of the kinsmen was delicate and that of the others was dull and sluggish, but it would have been harder to prove to every bystander that it was so. So this is something I think is quite interesting, a point that Hume is making here. I like it because I think it actually applies much more broadly, besides just aesthetical judgments, but other kinds of judgments. There's a claim that you can find in Plato, which I would say is a very popular claim that almost every philosopher almost every philosopher seems to subscribe to. And the claim is this: if something is true and right and correct, and you know it and you understand it, you have to be able to explain to somebody else. If you can't explain it to somebody else and you can't put it into words, it's useless and you don't really know it. You don't really understand it. You don't. So true knowledge has to be accompanied by an account, by a logos, is what Plato would say. And Hume, he seems to be pushing back on this, at least when it comes to artistic judgments. He's going to say that you can be right about this. You can say that this tastes good, this tastes bad, or this tastes salty, or this tastes leathery, or whatever. And even though you can't really explain it, you can still be right. You know, so being correct and being true isn't always tied to some rational account of why it's the case, and still yet there's some truth to it. He says, similarly, even if the beauties of writing had never been tackled methodically and reduced to general principles, and even if no works had ever been generally acknowledged to be excellent models, still the different degrees of taste would have existed, and one man's judgment would have been better than another's. But it would have been harder to silence the bad critic, who in the absence of agreed rules and models could have always insisted upon his particular sentiment and refused to submit to his antagonist. So obviously, you know, he says sometimes we can perceive, judge, sense something correctly, but at the same time we can't give a reason, a proof, or an account of it, right? And that's, you know, why is this the case? We can't produce the key with the leather strap, and yet we're still correct. We still perceive something true. So unfortunately, he says, without finding the key to the leather strap, we're really like in a bind. We don't really have much to say to the bad critic. He's going to try to establish some ground rules. And to me, I rather like this article, but I have to say this is one of the weak points of it. I'm not so sure that he's going to, I don't know if we're going to have time for this. We might have to take a break and come back on this and tackle this in the later half of the class. But he's going to try to establish, you know, some rules for, you know, how do you silence the bad critic? How do you silence the guy who says Taco Bell is just as good as the best Mexican restaurant in Houston? You know, like, no, I went to Ninfa's on navigation, or I went to El Tiempo and we got like the best stuff, and like, no, Taco Bell's better. You know, how do we respond to that person? We've got to have some standard or something to go on. And so Hume's going to try to find something. He's going to try to find some anchor to latch on to. And maybe, I don't know, maybe this is a good place to pause. Let me look at the time. What is it? 1:17. Let me stop the video share. This is actually a pretty good stopping point. So why don't we take our break just a tad bit early today? Let's take about 13 minutes or so. So let's start up about 40 minutes, or sorry, 30 minutes after, about 1:30, maybe a few minutes after that. So, you know, go ahead and I'll pause the video right now. So now we're recording. Nobody had anything they wanted to say about Hume, or any questions about the lecture so far? Comments? No? All right, well, let me get back to where we left off. We're going to talk about the rest of this this essay by David Hume, Standard of Taste, and now we're getting into the details of how do you become a good critic, and how do you silence the bad critic, the ones who think that Taco Bell is better than you know, your favorite Mexican restaurant in Houston. He insists that there are actually criteria by which you can oppose the bad critic, he says, and this is the quote I'm drawing from here. He says, in the state of affairs that we actually have, where there are rules and models, we can confront the bad critic. Okay, so the rules and models, remember, I like Hassan's way of putting it. It's like an aggregate of sentiments, kind of what it is. Those are the rules. The rules and models come from experience. And what do we experience? We experience great works of art that endure through time and endure throughout prejudices and our own personal biases, and still please, etc. And so since we have those models, we can use those to oppose the critic. We can confront the bad critic, and here's all bullet point out the methodology, if you will. Show him an accepted principle of art, illustrate that this principle illustrate this principle by examples, which his own particular taste tell him are cases of the principle, and prove that the same principle can be applied to the present case where he didn't perceive or feel its influence. When we do all that, he must conclude that basically the fault lies in himself and that he lacks the delicacy of taste that is required for him to be conscious of every beauty and every blemish in any work of art. All right, so let's look at this. And this is like I said before the break. I think this is, I get it. I do this. I do this myself. I'm not saying I don't do it. So I'm guilty as charged. But is this really going to work? You really think this will work? So show him an accepted principle of art, illustrate by examples, which his own particular taste tell him are cases of the principle, and prove that the same principle can be applied to the present case where he didn't perceive or feel its influence. So in other words, show him, hey, you like that, or you don't like that, but why don't you like that? You should like it. Like, well, it sucks, that sucks. But you like this, you like that band and that other band, and they're the same kind of music. In fact, this band is actually a little bit better. So you recognize the beauty in those three bands. Why don't you recognize the beauty in this one musical group? Honestly, I don't know. I do that myself all the time. Usually it's when people, try to think of a good example. I'm always thinking of music. I love art in general, but I'm always just into, music's my fave, I guess, if I had to pick one. So I'm always thinking of like, popular music that is derivative of stuff that I like that's less popular. I'm like, all this. I got an example. I remember when this is funny. I remember when I was a teenager and I was driving around. My mom was driving us around. It was my sister and I and my mother. I don't forget where we were going, but that was the scenario. My mom, she's like an ex-hippie, whatever. She listens to all the cool, edgy. She thinks she keep up with the kids, I guess. So she was into like 9 Inch Nails and Nirvana when we were listening to that when we were like 13, 14, 15. And remember one day we were driving in the car and I put on this cassette tape and the first song came on and my mom was like, this is awful. What is this, Travis? Nirvana, they ain't. And I was like, actually, Mom, Nirvana, they are. She'd heard like Nirvana's album Nevermind, which was like, I guess it's a more commercial sounding album, and the one I was playing was like their first album, Bleach, which is a little bit more like punk and aggressive and hard or whatever. And I was like, but Mom, I was like, really, you can. And they would always get mad at my music because like my parents were both old hippies, and so they would always criticize all like the real angry punk rock. They're like, he's just yelling, he's just screaming. That's not talent. That's just screaming. And I'm like, and then I would go get the John Lennon record. I'd be like, oh hey, why don't we listen to that song Instant Karma at the end of it? Instant Karma! He's screaming at the end of that. It's like, you like John Lennon though. I mean, it's just because he's got long hair and the circular glasses and he's singing about peace and stuff, you just don't like this, I'm going to but yes, I agree. Bleach is a great album. I think I don't know if that's my favorite, but it was when I was a teenager. I played the hell out of it, especially the first side. Well, I guess now they don't have album sides, but I think it ended with Negative Creep. No, that was the first song. It was Paper Cuts or something, but that first side of Bleach was just, I wore out my cassette tape for sure. But my mom was like, I like Nevermind. I don't like this earlier Nirvana. This is just angry. That was her. He sounds angry. It's like, he sounds angry and Smells Like Teen Spirit. But you got the video on MTV. It's all cool looking. And, I'd always give my mom grief about that kind of stuff. But it wouldn't work. She's not going to like Bleach. I don't think she might like that, a couple tracks off of it. You might play About a Girl and she'd dig it at because it's kind of poppy. But yeah, so I don't know if this method's going to work. I mean, but it's about all you can do. If you do meet somebody who says, no, Taco Bell's really good, you're like, it's not that good. Look, here's a good burrito. Here's a good taco. Like, here's a really, no, dude, Taco Bell. I mean, you're not going to, if they're going to be that stubborn, you're not going to change their mind with this method, I think. So, But he says, though, that even though, like I was saying earlier, not everybody has this delicacy of taste. Sancho Panza's kinsmen had it, but not the people that were around them. They couldn't taste the leather. But he says you can improve it. You can improve your taste. You can get better at it. And so he'll start talking about, so how do you silence the bad critic, and how do you become a good critic? He says it's generally acknowledged that every sense or faculty shows itself to perception when it perceives with exactness its tiniest objects. This is sort of what he's talking about earlier, right? The critic that's good, that has good taste, can see subtle things that are lost to other viewers or other tasters. So the smaller the objects that the eyes are sensitive to, the finer the eye, the more elaborate its structure. You don't test whether someone has a good palate by giving him food with strong flavors. Rather, you give him a mixture of small ingredients, where we are still aware of each part despite its smallness and its being mixed in the rest. People naturally differ widely in how much delicacy of taste they have, but such differences aren't set in stone. In this respect, one can improve. The best way to increase and improve one's delicacy of taste is to practice in a particular art, and often experiencing or thinking about a particular sort of beauty. So what he means here about practice a particular art, he's not saying that if you want to appreciate music, you have to be a musician, or that if you want to be a good judge of good food, you have to be a good cook. That might help, especially I think with the musician one, but it's not necessary. What he means is you have to actually try it a bunch. If you're going to be a good music critic, you have to be well versed in all types of music and how music works and what, so you have to have practice in it, as he puts it, practice experiencing it. You also practice gives skill and dexterity in carrying out any work, and gives equal skill and dexterity in judging it. Practice is so helpful to the discernment of beauty that before we can judge any work of importance, we need to confront that very work more than once. So not only do we have to confront many works, and so to be a good music critic, we have to not just listen to one music or one type of music or one musician, but all sorts of, but we have to go back and revisit the same work of art again and again. And we find that upon further reflection, the art becomes better. And sometimes the opposite happens, right? Sometimes music that will catch you, that's real catchy, and you like it at first, after a while it becomes annoying. You're like, that song's stupid. Why did I ever like that? That's a dumb song. Where other music, where maybe, I know this would happen to me a lot when I was growing up, and bands would come out with a new album. It was a band that I was into, but then they released a new album, and I guess I was expecting something more similar to the previous album, and then I'd listen to it, and I'm like, I don't know if I like this new album. And then I'd hear it a few more times, and I'd be like, nah, man, this is better. I think Faith No More, that's a good example. What is it? The Real Thing. I mean, that's a good album. I like the album, The Real Thing. But then they came out with Angel Dust. And when I first heard Angel Dust, it was just like, I don't know if I like this really. It's kind of weird. It doesn't sound like their last album. But then I listened to it 3 or 4 more times. And then after a while, I was like, this is brilliant. Like, this is a really well produced album, and all the songs are very unique. I mean, I still think it's their best album, but it took a few listens, right? So one's first experience of a work of art brings a flutter or hurry of thought. So you have to, let me back up, I skipped a little bit there. You have to confront it more than once, carefully and deliberately surveying it in different lights. Again, it brings a flurry of thought. It gets in the way of genuine sentiment of beauty. One doesn't notice how the parts of the work are interrelated. You might not hear all the different elements within the musical composition, because just the louder ones jump out at you at first. You don't pick out very well the feature that give the work its style. The various perfections and defects seem to be wrapped up in a sort of confusion and present themselves to the imagination in a jumble. Not to mention that there's a florid and superficial kind of beauty that pleases at first, but after being found incompatible with a true expression, either of reason or emotion, soon becomes cloying and boring, and then is scornfully rejected, or at least valued much less highly. So how do we do this, right? He already told us, right? We have to, well, one is, we talked about this before the break, we have to be in the right setting. We have to, not be distracted by all these things. Our roommate can't be walking in every 5 minutes and chatting us up. I always hate that about having a roommate. I love living by myself because it's like, your controller, I get to watch this movie and just focus on this freaking movie. I don't have to worry about this dude coming in and be like, hey man, did you hear about this on Twitter? And I'm just like, man, I'm watching this. I don't want to be rude, but are people who talk while you're watching the movie with them? I'm sorry, it's one of my pet peeves, right? So that's one thing, but also too, like he says, you have to revisit a work again and again. And another thing he adds, you have to compare it to other works. To continue in the practice of contemplating any degree of beauty, one often has to compare different sorts and degrees of excellence and to estimate their proportion to each other. A man who has had no opportunity to compare the different kinds of beauty is indeed totally unqualified to give an opinion about any object presented to him. It is only through comparisons that we develop a fixed, established terminology for expressing praise and blame, and learn how to make the intensity of our praise or blame appropriate. Okay, so yeah, you can't just listen to one album of music of a certain type and just judge from it. Like, I remember the first time that I had Indian food. I mean, now Indian food is like my favorite, well, one of my favorite kinds of food. I don't know if I'd say it's I don't know if I have a favorite, but certainly Indian is on the top of the list. But I remember the first time that I had it, it was I grew up in San Antonio, and my friend, she was vegan, or I think she wasn't vegan yet. She was vegetarian at the time, but whatever. She loved Indian food, and she took me to this vegan or vegetarian Indian place. And that was my first experience of Indian food, and it sucked. Like, it was not good. The place, I mean, I don't know what she ordered, but what I ordered was not good. I didn't like it. I didn't see what she saw in it, and it turned me off from Indian food forever. And it wasn't until like maybe 10 years later, 10 years later, when I was living in Austin, and my buddy Greg was like, dude, Indian food's great, man, and you gotta go to let's go to this buffet. And he took me to this Indian buffet up in North Austin. And I was like, this is the bomb, man. Like, this food's good. So it's like, and so, I mean, now I could tell, like, if I have food that's Indian and it sucks, like, I know what bad Indian food's like. I know it. At first, I thought it all sucked, right? So, maybe the first time you hear a certain style of music, you might not like that style of music, but maybe it's the band, or maybe it's the particular musician. So you have to sort of be familiar with the genre and be familiar with all the different types of it to know what's a good version, what's a bad version, and that sort of thing. So all of this too ties into his ultimate theme here. It's all from experience. It's all based on experience. It's not a priori. It's not some mathematical thing that just is, but it's something that we gain through knowledge of through experience. So this is similar with developing good taste. So he says you also have to remove any prejudice you have. So you might have like, let's say you don't like Indian food, but you've got to be a food critic, right? Well, maybe you should recuse yourself from that review, or go into it thinking, look, well, I don't like particularly this type of food, but if you like it, it's very fresh, it was very well done. You have to try to be as objective as you possibly can. I think this would be really hard to do with food, but probably maybe easier to do with music. I'm not a huge fan of, I don't want to say I don't like hip hop, but I don't want an expert on hip hop. I mean, I know if it's anything past like the 90s or like the early 2000s, I don't really know much about it. And so I wouldn't be a good judge about, I think, that type of music and what was good, what was better than some others. But if I was going to be a critic, I'd have to like test it out. I have to like listen to all, the contemporary stuff and sort of understand it. And my own prejudices, maybe hip hop's not a good example, because I do I love some of that type of music. I love old school rap, and even like country music. Like people always say, I like every kind of music except for rap and country. That used to be kind of a saying. I don't know if it still is, but you hear people say that a lot. I like all kinds of music except for rap and country. You know, I like it all, except I guess like there was this genre in the 90s and the early 2000s which I haven't heard much of before. It was called world music. I never liked world music much. It was like this disco-y, like they would take indigenous music from like Africa, the Middle East, and all, and they'd like add some clubby, like it was really, I thought, horrible stuff. Like that's just bad music. Adult contemporary, ska is pretty weird. Yeah, I admit I don't like ska that much, but there are some good ska bands. Like I like Madness. Madness is legit, and the Specials. They've got some good stuff, you know. But in general, I'm not a big or that real poppy emo type punk. I'm not really a big fan of that either. But so as a critic, though, I would have to be able to somehow distance myself from that and just say, look, I don't like emo punk. I don't like that kind of music. It's sort of annoying to me, the vocals and stuff. But like as far as that genre goes, the song was well written. It was well produced. You know, it was clever, I suppose. It's just not my taste. So a good critic is kind of hard to do. You've got to somehow detach yourself from some sort of prejudice that you might have, and be able to look at things again as objectively as is possible. As he says, if the critic is to do this thoroughly, he must keep his mind free from all prejudice, allowing nothing to enter into his consideration but the one particular work that he is examining. Every work of art, in order to produce its proper effect on the mind, must be surveyed from a certain point of view. And it won't be fully appreciated by people whose situation, real or imaginary, doesn't fit the one that the work requires. A person influenced by prejudice doesn't comply with this condition, but obstinately maintains his natural position without getting himself into the point of view that the performance requires. If the work if the work is aimed at people of a different age or nation from his own, he makes no allowance for their special views or prejudices. Instead, full of the custom of his own time and place, he rashly condemns what seems admirable in the eyes of all the people for whom the discourse was intended. I don't know. This example popped in my mind. I remember I was dating this one girl, man. She really annoyed the hell out of me because we could never watch a movie. She would always comment on really dumb stuff that had nothing to do with the movie. And there was like one of my favorite movies, Chinatown. The main character, Faye Dunaway, plays is this kind of rich upper class woman in the 1940s in Los Angeles, and she dresses that way. She dresses with the veil over her face all the time, and the what is it the what do they call that, pin box hat or pin, I forgot the name of the hat, but it's a cute little hat the women used to wear in the 40s. Pillbox hat, I think is what they called it. It's not important, but whatever. That kept distracting her. I couldn't. And this movie is a great film, and she's like, "Your makeup's weird. Look at her eyebrows, and she looks weird. You like this movie? They're dressed weird. It's the 40s. That's how they dressed back then, you know." That relationship didn't last, obviously, but yeah, he's talking about this kind of stuff. You can't let that get in your way. If not, you're not a good critic. You're looking at very superficial things. So he says, you know, you condemn what seemed admirable in the eyes of all the people for whom the discourse was intended. If the work was done for the public, he never sufficiently enlarges his grasp, or he forgets his bias as a friend or enemy, as a rival or friendly commentator. In this way, his sentiment is perverted, and the beauties and blemishes of the work he's judging don't affect him in the way they would have if he'd forced his imagination to stay under control and had forgotten himself for a moment. So his taste evidently departs from the true standard and consequently loses all credit and authority. Now, this is a similar point you're going to see in Kant. Again, they don't disagree on everything. I think on the essentials they do. But on this part, there's something that Kant says is very similar. You're going to see that when we get to Kant next week. But the idea is that, you know, you might not like a particular work of art for a personal reason, but that personal reason is not a blemish on the art. You need to be kind of detach your own personal biases from that judgment and let go of yourself in a certain sense and just view the work as objectively as one possibly can. So how does the intellect or the understanding play a role in our aesthetic judgments? Hume doesn't really spend a whole lot of time treating this. It's rather brief. By the way, when we get to Kant, this is about all he does. All he talks about is the role of the intellect and what you might call the understanding in our aesthetic judgments. That for him is key. But for Hume, obviously, because judgments of beauty are based on our experience, and our experience is often organized by our understanding or our intellect, the way that we interpret it, this is definitely going to play a role. So what role does it play? He says, well, one, the interrelating of the parts. Our mind helps to understand how the parts relate to each other, why they relate to each other the way they do, why that's good or beautiful or aesthetic. We are able to discern the aim or the purpose of its execution. That for Aristotle would have been the focus. Remember, for Aristotle, he was teleological. It's all about the telos. Every work of art is judged by its aim. It is part of it for Hume, but not all, right? You have to, how the parts interrelate. I mean, that's important. Remember, for Aristotle, how the parts interrelate are important, but they're subservient to the aim. They're related in such a way that leads towards the goal. So the goal is key. But Hume doesn't seem to have a hierarchy. He just lists, right? Like, okay, so this is important. This is important. Certainly the way the parts of the story relate, the parts of the song, the melody and the harmony, the elements in the painting, whatever, how they relate, that's a part of it. The purpose of the work of art, what is it trying to do? Is it trying to elicit emotions? Is it just trying to entertain you? What's the purpose? And then third, we have to evaluate whether it's reasonable, probable, or not too far-fetched. This also echoes back, I think, a bit to Aristotle. He was talking about the characters and how the characters have to be believable and the plot has to be believable. Even though it might be fantastical, it still has to sort of fulfill some sort of logic. I used the example from Game of Thrones, I think, last week about how, look, I'm willing to sort of suspend my disbelief about like zombies and dragons and stuff, but be consistent. You said the zombies can't go into the water, and you got the zombies dragging dragons out of the water. How does that happen, right? So it has to be reasonable, probable, not too far-fetched. Even if it's a fantasy, it has to be somewhat believable, or that will throw it off. That will throw off your enjoyment of it aesthetically. So he sort of extrapolates on these points here, or elaborates on them rather. He says, in all the most notable productions of genius, the parts of the work are interrelated in significant ways, and its beauties and blemishes cannot be perceived by someone whose thought is not capacious, doesn't have the capacity. It's not capacious enough to take in all those parts, holding them together in a single thought in order to perceive the texture and uniformity of the whole. This is kind of a snobby point, but I think he's kind of right about this. Maybe I'm a snob, I guess, but maybe some people can't appreciate jazz music or classical music. It's too complicated. It has too many elements. People are used to pop. That's why pop music is so popular. It's called pop for a reason. Is because it's simple. It's just very simple. Usually a 4/4 beat. It's dancey, repetitive. There's not a lot of elements to it, so it doesn't require a lot of discernment. And so does that mean it's less? I don't know. That's something I don't know. I don't argue that. But certainly I think it requires a little bit more discernment to appreciate a Beethoven sonata than it does to enjoy, even like the Nirvana. Like I like Nirvana and but like Beethoven and Mozart, I guess by this argument, are going to require more sensibility than enjoying like a Gigi Allen record or something like that, right? So that's it. How the parts interrelate, and the more complex they are, the more taste and understanding that you're going to need to discern them. So the intellect certainly plays a role. Also, and this again back to the Aristotle way of seeing things, there's always a purpose. Every work of art has a certain end or purpose, which it is designed to achieve, and it is to be judged as more or less perfect depending on how much or how little it is fitted to attain its end. Right? That's straight up Aristotle's aesthetics right there. Eloquence aims to persuade. History aims to instruct. Poetry aims to please by means of the emotions and the imagination. Now, this is where I think he may be oversimplistic, even if he's right, even if works of art always have an aim, that's disputable. But if works of art have an aim and you can judge them based on whether or not they achieve that aim, that might be true. But just because that's true, does it mean that the aim of all poetry is just to please? That's what he says. Remember, like, what makes something good, what makes something beautiful? It pleases us. That's it. It's based on experience, the experience of what pleases. Kant will have none of that. You're going to see when we get to Immanuel Kant, no, it has nothing to do with pleasure. Pleasure is different than beautiful. Beauty and pleasure, not the same thing. And beauty and good, not the same thing either. So Kant's going to step away from Plato as well. So he says, we must keep these ends constantly in mind when we survey any performance, and we must be able to judge how suitable the means are for their respective purposes. Okay, so first you need how the parts relate to the ends, and then third, the last one, we have to evaluate whether something is reasonable, far-fetched, etc. Also, every kind of composition, even the most poetic, is nothing but a chain of propositions and reasonings, not always perfectly precise and valid, but still plausible, however much disguised by the coloring of the imagination. The personages in tragedy and epic poetry must be represented as reasoning, thinking, concluding, and acting suitably to their character and their circumstances. And a poet can't hope to succeed in such a delicate undertaking unless he employs judgment as well as taste and invention. Okay. So the intellect, especially, I guess, in composition, does play a role. Do the characters make sense? Does the character development make sense? If it doesn't, it's not gonna please. It'll be too distracting to the spectator, to the aesthetic experience. So it's not something, our judgment, our intellect is not something you need in addition to having good taste. It is actually a prerequisite for good taste. If you don't have good judgment, you won't have this list of bullet points he has here. You won't have an excellence of faculties that contributes to the improvement of your reason. You won't have clearness of conception, exactness in making distinctions, and what does he call liveliness of uptake? I take that what he means by that, liveliness of uptake. I think what he means by that is the ability to see things and catch subtle things that happen. Another thing that annoys me about watching movies with others that aren't very attentive, especially like I keep using that movie Chinatown as an example, because this happened also during that same experience. We're watching Chinatown, and there are subtle things that happen in that movie that if you miss them, if you do not watch, like if you turn your head away from the screen for a minute, or you check your phone for just a second, you might miss a clue. You're going to miss something that happened in the movie, and when something else jumps in at the end, you're not going to get it. You're like, whoa, like, how did he know that? How did he know to look there? Why did he know the glasses were going to be in that pool? If you missed the little comment that was made earlier in the movie while he was just talking to the landlady or whatever, it's just so I mean, this is something that is necessary if you're gonna see a sophisticated work of art that has all these subtle details that come together and interrelate. You have to have a liveliness of uptake and ability to discern all these details. So for him, all of these are essential to the operations of true taste and always accompany it. If a man who has experience in some art form also has good sense, he will almost certainly be a good judge of beauties in that art form. If a man doesn't have a sound understanding, he will almost certainly not have good taste. So, and Hume thinks this is actually rare. He thinks that, we all think we're good critics and we all think we have good taste, but Hume does not think that these people are very common. They're just about as rare as the artists themselves. And he says, where do we find these critics? He sort of asks these questions. Where do we find them? What signs can we know them by? How are we distinguish them from the fakes, the real critics from the bad critics? Well, for him, these aren't questions of fact. They're not questions of sentiment. They are questions of fact. They are questions of fact, which you might think they aren't. But remember, for him, look, if you survey the world, you can kind of see which works of art stand the test of time, which ones don't. That's a fact. People still read Homer. They don't read all the other poets that lived back then. There are a few. There's Hesiod, there's Pindar, but only a few have survived. Now, maybe those are bad examples because some of those people survived just because we happen to have their writings, and some were just lost. But you get the overall point. So he says, whether any particular person is endowed with good sense and a delicate imagination that is free from prejudice may often be the subject of a dispute and be liable to great discussion and inquiry. But all mankind will agree that such a character is valuable and admirable. When these doubts occur, men can only do what they do with other disputable questions that are submitted to the understanding. They must produce the best arguments that their ingenuity suggests to them. They must acknowledge that a true and decisive standard exists somewhere, namely real existence and matter of fact. They must be patient with people who differ from them in their appeals to this standard. All I need for my present purpose is to have proved the taste of all individuals is not on equal footing, and that there are some men, however hard it may be to say which men, whom everyone will acknowledge to have a preference above all others. Okay, so again, he's reiterating this point that there are real standards, right? There are real standards for taste based on what pleases generally, and some people are better at seeing this than others. Some people have more refined senses and more refined understanding to be able to perceive these things. And even though it's hard for us to come to an agreement about this, he makes a pretty controversial claim here that it's no different in science, and it's even worse in science, he says. Let's read this quote and see what his argument for that would be. He says the difficulty of finding the standard of taste, even in particular cases, isn't as great as it's said to be. In theory, we may readily accept that there is a sure criterion in science and deny that there is one for sentiment. In practice, we find that the criterion for science is actually harder to pin down than the one for sentiment. Theories of abstract philosophy, systems of profound theology have held sway during one age and then later been universally exploded. Their absurdity has been detected. Other theories and systems have taken their place, and they in turn were supplanted by their successors. We've never known anything more open to revolutions of chance and fashion than those purported decisions of science. And I think that language is a little too strong. I don't think that scientific revolutions are really just absolutely matters of fashion and chance. I think it's a little bit more to it than that, but it's fair. I think the point he's making is still a little bit fair here. He says, the case is not the same with beauties of eloquence and poetry. Well done expressions of passion and nature are sure, after a little time, to earn the public applause they deserve and maintain it forever. So for him, you can look back at the theory of the cosmos of the Roman astronomer Ptolemy, and you're like, what an idiot, what a fool. And by the way, he wasn't an idiot, he wasn't a fool, but he was wrong. I'm sorry, the Earth is not in the center of the universe. Remember, we had our scientific revolution. You must have, I hope, learned about that in your history class. But after the scientific revolution, all these theories were supplanted, right? We had the Copernican revolution, and now the Earth is seen as the center, or the sun is seen as the center of our solar system. Planets revolve around it. But we still read Homer. We still think Homer was a great poet and told, great poems and all this. So he says that, artistic standards, although it's not as easy to point them out as we would want them to be, they're not as hard sometimes as scientific standards, despite our intuitions that we reflect on. It's a pretty controversial claim that he's making here. I think that maybe modern scientists might want to chime in and say, that used to be true, but it's no longer true because our science is more, it's much more solid than the pre-Copernican science, and we're on sure footing now. But you got to realize atomic theory is less than a century old, or I guess it's about a century old now. So, if you lived about 150 years ago, people would laugh at you if you talked about atoms. Atoms? What are you talking about? There's atom cell. These are new theories, and so he's got a point. He says fads come and go, but true artistic greatness has this staying power. He says, though men of delicate taste are rare, they can easily be picked out in society by the soundness of their understanding. So how do we know who a good critic is? They're the ones that know Homer's good before we do, I guess, right? They're the ones that they saw it first. You know, that kind of gets on my nerves, though. I think a lot of people are what I call neophytes. Well, I don't call them that. It's an actual word. Neophytes. You sort of worship what's new. And it seems like a lot of people that are into music or fashion, they just want to be the first. You know, they don't really care about the music or the fashion. They just want to say they were there. I was at the first show. I was at the first concert. I was into it before everybody else thought it was cool. That kind of annoys me. But the people that really do see this stuff, right? Like they're the people that go out and discover Nirvana and just, they signed them and all that. That's who he's talking about, not the ones that are just trend. They want to do it for trendy reasons. No, these are the ones that are like, no, like I was into them before everybody else was, because man, look, they're good. They're good. I mean, they don't need PR and posters and advertising. You just listen to the music; it's there. But for some other less discerning ears, maybe not. So they're able to understand this. They can be easily, by their understanding, they can be picked out from the rest of mankind. Because of the high status they've acquired, their lively approval of any work tends to become the general view. Right? These are the trendsetters, I guess, or what do they call them now? Influencers or something like that. They're in social media influencers. I hate to use that term because some influencers are pretty nauseous, but anyway, many men, when left to themselves, have only a faint and hesitant perception of beauty, and yet they can enjoy any fine stroke that is pointed out to them. And this is kind of, I think people are like, why do we have critics? Stop criticizing. Like, I think artists complain about critics a lot. You're just criticizing because you can't create. You're just, why don't you try to make a movie if you don't like mine? You hear that sometimes from directors and artists, why don't you do it if you think it's so? I remember one time I was making fun of Lenny Kravitz when I was working at Whole Foods, and the guy, he was a baby boomer guy, and he was all jamming out to Lenny Kravitz. He's like, this is cool, right, Travis? Like, American Woman. I was like, nah, dude, sorry. Like, I don't like him, And he's like, you do better than. And I was like, man, give me $1 million recording studio, and I will make a better album than this guy. Sorry if any Lenny Kravitz fans are out there. But there is a role for the critic, because a critic, it's not just negative. The critic can be positive, and maybe you might not really appreciate a film or a work of art or a book or something, but then when you have somebody explain it to you in a deeper way, and you understand the connotations, like I didn't really like Brave New World that much when I read it in high school. I thought it was just kind of I didn't get it, I think. And now that I still don't think it's as well written as people make it out to be. He's an all right writer. But I think I went back to it with more understanding, I think. And so a good critic can do this. You can read a review of a movie or an album, and maybe if you went to the movie and just watched on your own, you wouldn't have got it, and you wouldn't have picked up on some of the things that the critic can point out to you. So every convert to the admiration of the real poet or orator is the cause of some new conversion. Prejudices may come out on top for a while, but they never unite in celebrating any rival to the true genius. And eventually they give way to the force of nature and sound sentiment. Thus, though a civilized nation may easily be mistaken in which philosopher they choose to admire, they have never been found to err for long, at least for long, in their affection for a favorite writer of epics or tragedies, right? So even scientific theories, he says, can't claim this. We still celebrate the works of some of these great writers. We're not celebrating the astronomy of Ptolemy anymore. We learn about it in history just because it's interesting, but nobody takes it serious as science anymore. Okay, let's see how we're doing on time, because I think I need to probably speed it up a bit here. I've got like 4 or 5 slides to go, and I've got quite a lot quoted here. I don't know if I'm going to read the whole quote. Let me try to paraphrase as much as I can, because I want to leave a little bit of time at the end of class to get a preview of Kant. So if I go over all this, we just won't have time for that. So, but let's just read the basics. Okay, I've got kind of broken down here. So we make a judgment about something, an aesthetic judgment, whether something's beautiful or ugly, or something like this pleases us or doesn't please us. There are two sources of difference, Hume claims. Different temperaments of different men, and or particular manners and opinions of our age and our country. And he says, for him, these are not enough to smudge all the boundaries of beauty and ugliness, but they do produce differences in how much a work is approved or disapproved. And so I feel like this is a bit of a recap or kind of a repeat of what we've already said earlier about how to properly engage in art, that you have to remove your own prejudices and biases and these sort of things. And those could be cultural. They're not just your physical state. If you have a fever, your taste buds are weakened, but also too, your own upbringing, your culture. You might see some movie from another culture and they have different practices from you. I know nudity, nudity is always, we live in, we're in America, and I guess people think of America as this indulgent capitalist society. It's all sex and money and stuff. But we're actually, aesthetically, our temperament is pretty puritanical. To some degree. Sure, there's sex all over the place. Sex sells. Sex is in the movies, whatever. But I think that, nudity is like, oh my God, nakedness. I watched some film a long time ago. It was this documentary. It must be at least 10 years old, but so I don't know if I got the title right, but I think the title is "This Film Is Not Yet Rated." That's the name of the movie. This film is not yet rated, and it's a documentary about the rating system in America. And it talks about how in America, if you show full frontal nudity, you see genitals, waist down, naked, it's automatically rated NC-17, automatic. But you can have all sorts of violence, and it might even still be rated PG-13. Like, people can die as long as there's no blood. There can be slight cuss words. So it's kind of like, when I heard that, I was like, that's kind of messed up. So people freak out when they see Janet Jackson's nipple, during the Super Bowl halftime show, and it's like, my kid saw a nipple, how horrible! Ah! It's like, but they go take him to see the Rambo movie or something. It's kind of weird to me. I always thought that was a weird thing about our culture. But yeah, so he says that you have to sort of be able to appreciate. You might see a foreign film that has all this nudity and you're just not used to it. And somebody else that's from that country is going to be like, what? It's a naked person. Big deal. Why are you so like, oh, look at her boobs, that kind of thing. So, but he says, ultimately, you're going to have different character types, different temperaments, as he said, right? Different art appeals to different people, right? Like all these, I was looking up on Google images, like punk rocker, goth person, and hip hop person. And like, I got all sorts of crazy. These are like the best thing I could approximate, right? You've got this sort of, you're just a young, rebellious spirit, and you want to listen to your Dead Kennedys, and your Minor Threat. And I'm not your stepping stone, that kind of stuff, then, but maybe you're just more of the hip hop temperament, or you're dark, you're the goth chick or something. I guess a good critic, though, would be able to listen to hip hop, punk rock, goth, and even if they don't like those genres, they would recognize like a good goth band versus a really crappy one, like you could listen to Bauhaus and be like, okay, I don't like Bauhaus. It's so gloomy and it's too dark and depressing, but the lyrics are well done. The instrumentation is interesting, well produced, very creative. Not my cup of tea, but then you listen to like some other like rip off wannabe goth band, and you're like, yeah, these guys are lame. That kind of thing. So some people, they're more drawn to comedy. Some are more drawn to tragedy. Sometimes it has to do with age. If you're older, you might want something more chill or something like that. Or I don't know. Like sometimes I go through different moods. I'm working out. I want to rock out to the heavy metal or the death metal or the hardcore punk. I keep bringing up the gym, man. That's one thing one thing I don't get about the gym is why they play the music they play. All this top 40 dance music, that does not inspire me. Maybe chicks. I guess if you're a girl, I hate to be like, use assume traditional gender roles or stereotypes, but I don't see dudes like jamming out to like Britney Spears while they're pumping iron. Like I don't understand why they don't play like Metallica or something. I guess that's not popular for a more general audience, I suppose. So they gotta play the more, you know, mainstream music. But it always like, I'm like, this is a gym. Why are we listening to the, you know, all these like poppy girl songs or whatever? The best gyms don't play any music. Yeah, that'd be great. I would much prefer silence. I'd much prefer just, you know, focus on your workout. Yeah. Um, but yeah, so I'm not going to read this whole quote. Let me read the last few lines. He says, it's almost impossible not to feel some inclination. Oh, geez, I got all my word. Some inclination in favor. There's no standard by which such an argument can be decided. So, you know, if you prefer goth type music to punk music, or you like, you know, salsa music or whatever type of music is your favorite, yeah, there's good of all those genres. Stupid to sort of argue that one genre is better than another. They're just suited for different character types. But within good and bad, you know, things that please and displease, things that generally are, you know, good or not. Let's see. Hassan's got a comment here. I got a few comments here. Neophyte. Oh yeah, neophile. That's the word I was meant to use. Not neophyte. Neophile. Yeah, I misspoke earlier when I said neophyte. Neophile, someone who loves new. If it's new, it's good. But yeah, you're right. Neophyte is just somebody who's new to something. Don't ask questions, just consume product and get excited for next product. Most places. Yeah, I think this is sort of, yeah, what Hume is talking about. This is something that we all fall prey to. And so if we fall prey to that, then, you know, that's a sign we're not a good critic, that we have a prejudice. My screen completely froze up. I'm going to hit the escape button and hopefully are you guys hearing me? Hold on, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen here because I don't know what's going on. Maybe my internet is experiencing some turbulence.
Oh my goodness.
I got a completely blank screen now. Can anybody hear me or see me?
Yes, yes, we can. I can.
Well, one person. Okay, my computer screen is completely blank. Okay, now I see me and Kill and Hassan and Nathan. Okay, geez, I'm gonna stop my screen share. I really need to upgrade my computer, I'm afraid.
Yeah, a bunch of us.
I think it's my hard drive, perhaps.
A bunch of us were typing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. It looks like it. No. Okay. Now I can finally see the chat box and everything. Okay. Well, it's 2:21, so let me hope. I'm gonna hope that by doing this, it's not gonna freeze up again. But I'm gonna go back to my slideshow, and I'm not really gonna read all this stuff. I'm just gonna go through the last 2 or 3 slides to kind of get to an end point for Hume, and then I'll close things up and talk a little bit about Kant. But let's get back to where we left off. Okay. You know, now again, this is more on the cultural differences, but then he makes this other point. I have this picture of Robinson Crusoe. I've never read this book. I know it used to be required reading, and he talks about how, you know, sometimes there are things that are worthy of being, you know, even though, like, let's just say that Robinson Crusoe is a well-written book. I don't know if it is or not. You know, it is a classic. But let's just say it is a well-written book. If it somehow displays or seems to advocate a bad morality, like an evil or bad morality, then for Hume, that's actually is a blemish on the taste of it, and it's actually doesn't get in the way. This is where I think Kant would actually disagree with Hume on this. We'll come back to this when we get to Kant. We'll see what you guys think, but I think Kant would even say you got to even push that aside. Like, your ethical judgments are separate from your aesthetic judgments. But I bring up Robinson Crusoe because he's you know, apparently, and I've never read the book, so I don't know the full story, but he's a slave trader. That was his profession, and he gets stuck on an island. The story is, it's like a survivalist story. He gets shipwrecked on an island all by himself, and it's his ability to survive on the island. And it's a classic of Western literature, but the guy's a slave trader. And in fact, even on the island, he encounters some savages, and he's able to get one of the savages to be his slave. And it implies that there's a natural relationship between these savage people and the European whites, Robinson Crusoe. And I think Hume, although Hume was living in the 1700s, I don't know if he would use Robinson Crusoe as an example. He might be a racist himself. I don't think he wrote a lot about race, but I'm probably guessing it wouldn't have been good. I think that he would say, if he was like us and knew how horrible and stupid and irrational racism is, I hope all of us are aware of that, that he would probably admit this is a bad story. It's not a good story. It's not a good work of art. Bad ethics can screw up good art. If a good work of art, it's a good painting, it's a good movie, like the way it's technically done is skillful, but it's just abhorrent, then that would get in the way of aesthetic enjoyment, of it pleasing us. And in a way, he seems to be agreeing with Plato here, but for different reasons. Like Plato says that good art is art that makes us good people, and so it makes us moral characters. Good art will, if the guardians the guardians that are going to protect our city see art of noble and good heroes, they'll want to copy and mimic that behavior. And so that's why Plato doesn't like bad, unethical things in art. But Hume is just talking about how we feel. We watch it and we're like, how can I relate to this main character? He's a dick, or he's a slave trader or whatever. Yes, Charles says authors on race pre-mid 20th century is usually bad. Yeah, it is. I mean, I find myself like I have to, make allowances for it. Sometimes you'll be reading an otherwise good book, and then they'll say something that's like completely sexist or racist, and you're like, geez, man, like, it's hard to like not be bothered by that, and plus it's just off-putting because you're not used to it. We're not used to that sort of language in polite society, and here you are reading some smart, brilliant person otherwise say something just completely ignorant and stupid. And so Hume says, this will get in the way of our enjoyment. He does say, though, he mentions religion and science. I don't want to spend too much on this. Again, we're kind of running short on time, so I'm not going to read the quote. I'm just going to paraphrase. But basically, he says if you read like an old Greek play and they believe that some silly stuff is true, like they believe that the sun revolves around the earth, that won't get in the way. That he kind of allows for that kind of stuff. Or they believe in Zeus. They believe that Zeus is this god that throws lightning bolts down at you. So if it's a false religion or false religious belief that's being expressed, some outdated or outmoded theory that's being expressed in a work of art, then that's fine for Hume. He says that won't get in the way of it, as long as the religious sentiments expressed don't lead to immoral behaviors. Because then we're back to that first problem. If the piece seems to be portraying characters in a bad that are evil as good, then that kind of is unsettling to us as well. I'm trying to think, there's got to be exceptions to this. I'm thinking of the movie Clockwork Orange. I think, I'm going to write the title here, and I'm pretty sure, I don't know where, but I'm pretty sure that A Clockwork Orange, this movie comes up again in one of my later lectures. So there'll actually be a slide with the picture. But, one of my favorite movies is A Clockwork Orange, but you could argue that it actually doesn't live up to Hume's standard here. The movie is about a very troubled young man who is, I mean, maybe troubled is not the right word. He's sadistic. He's a criminal who likes to go around with his gang and basically terrorizes people. You know, he beats up homeless people. He fights other gangs. They rob, rape, and steal. And then he gets arrested and brainwashed to be good. You know, that's what the Clockwork Orange is all about. He's a clockwork. You know, they brainwash him to become good. And the movie, if you watch it, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but in case you want to go watch it, but you could argue that the movie seems to glorify his behavior, you know, but I still think it's a great film. Although I got to admit, I feel guilty liking it. I kind of feel guilty for liking it. I'm like, what does that say about me that I like this movie? But it was so well filmed and so well done, and the acting and the story and all that stuff. And Andrew's like, don't feel guilty, it's great. It's a great film. Kubrick is a great director. But I mean, it's definitely like, and you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but he based it on a novel by Anthony Burgess. And Anthony Burgess hates the movie because the movie changes the ending. The book has an extra chapter, and if you read the extra chapter of the book, it totally changes the meaning. It kind of changes the meaning of the whole story. And so I can kind of see why the novelist, but I honestly think the movie wouldn't have been as good if they had that extra chapter. So I'm glad that Kubrick did what he did, but I have to say, yeah, that movie, kind of like, is this glorifying his behavior? You know, what the heck? Yeah, he did. I think Kubrick worked with Anthony Burgess, but once the movie came out, he felt betrayed and he disowned it. In fact, Kubrick himself, I don't know if you know the story, but when that movie came out, that movie was banned in the UK. And it was not banned. It was not banned by the government. It was not banned by some the prime minister. It was banned by Kubrick himself. He said, I do want, he let the American audience were allowed to see it, but he banned that movie until about, I think 10 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago. I think it was like the 30th anniversary. They released it again in England. But the year it came out, it was in theaters for like less than a couple months, and people started copying the gangs. There were all these gangs and all this violence that was going on in London. And so Anthony Kubrick was like, no, don't show my film. Like he felt guilty about it. So, you know, like I didn't know that till recently. I just heard that, but I'd always felt kind of like, man, this movie's badass, but like why do I think it's badass? I shouldn't think, like, this movie's kind of, you know. But anyways, I'm kind of trailing off on Kubrick. Yeah, Fight Club, you might say. I don't know though, because Fight Club, at the end of Fight Club, I don't want to spoil the ending, but I think the ending is not as nihilistic as some people interpret it. So I think it depends on how you interpret Fight Club. But I could see you making the same point about that film as well. All right, well, let's wrap up. Let's try to wrap up Hume. We've only got, you know, I want to try to get out of here by 2:45. It's already 2:30. Hopefully we get out here even earlier. But I do want to say a few things about Kant. Otherwise, you're going to be lost when you try to do that reading. So again, let's just recap. What is David Hume's general point? Yes, there are standards of taste. They are there, but they're based on experience, right? He's the empiricist. All aesthetic experience is what our standard is based on, and what it's based on is what pleases us, what generally pleases most people throughout history. And people who have good standards, who have good taste, are especially good. They're especially perceptive when it comes to detecting the subtle qualities in these works of beauty and also pointing them out to others. And all of us can develop this taste. We can develop these good standards, but we have to do what we can to remove any prejudice and enjoy art under the right conditions. And really, these are questions that I typed up myself. You might say, well, aren't these standards too subjective? Does this really does this really answer the question? I mean, it seems like it's a very democratic type of aesthetics, whereas, you know, he says that some people are good critics, some are bad. You know, some people can tell something's good before everybody else does. You know, I guess there was Homer had his first fans, not Homer Simpson, obviously, but Homer the Greek poet, and they could see this better. But again, it seems like if it's based on experience and just on what pleases you, and what pleases you might be different under different conditions, I don't know, it just still seems kind of fuzzy, and it doesn't seem like he's pinned it down much. Like I said earlier, even if there are standards, it doesn't seem obvious what they are. Maybe it's obvious, and it's just because I have such weird and eclectic taste that it's hard for me. I mean, he's using examples that are like old. And you know what? I bet some of y'all don't think Homer's that great. I bet if you read him in the Greek, you'd probably be like, he's not that good. Why do they think he's so good? Yeah. So maybe standards do change. Is he maybe asserting more than he should be able to? And maybe he's right. I think if he's right, he's going to have to borrow from biology. It seems to me like what pleases us, if it's just in us, but there is something conforming to an object out there. In other words, there are sweet objects and sweetness pleases me. There are salty objects and salt is palatable. Then it seems like taste has a lot to do with biology. And so then we have to get into science. And I don't know. I'm not aware. I bet there are studies that focus on this, but I'm not aware of them. Maybe I should be. That's probably something that, given my specialty, I should study more of. But actual biological studies on aesthetics, on what pleases us. Are there uniform standards between animals? Are there ones that are unique to humans and unique to other animals? What are they based on? The design of our eyes, the design of our nose, the way that, I hate to say design because that makes it sound like there's a designer, but the natural composition of our organism is what determines what's right and wrong and what's beautiful and good to us. I don't think Hume has really answered this unless he wants to put on the biologist hat. No, I don't think he really intends to. I think he's really just sort of fleshing out a basic overall theory, and that's his main intention. Hume spent a lot more time on his epistemology and on his ethics. For him, that was the most important thing, were theories of value. But aesthetics are definitely, they have to do with some sort of values. So certainly this was a topic that he had to address in some form. But David Hume, I would say he's interesting. He's fun. This article is somewhat influential, but it's nowhere near as influential as what we're turning to next. If you had to pick, 2 or 3 maybe philosophers who have had the biggest impact on theory of art or theories of art and beauty, I'd have to say that we've already covered one of them, and that was Aristotle. And the other would be Kant. Kant, you really can't understate. And this is pretty impressive because you can say that with regards to Kant, you can say that about his ethics and about the way he handles epistemology. So Kant is almost bar none. Whether you like him or not, I think is beside the point. You could be a fan or a hater, but Kant is certainly an influential philosopher. So I warned you he's hard to read. So before I let you go today, let's try to get at least some start on Kant. I don't know if I want to jump into the PowerPoint just yet. Let's just do that next time. But remember, I said that David Hume was an empiricist. And that means that all knowledge originally is based on experience for David Hume. The opposing view to that would be something like rationalism. So we'll talk more about rationalism and empiricism at the beginning of class next week. But basically, the rationalist thought that all of our knowledge is not based on reason, but rather not based on experience, like the empiricist thought, but based on reason, based on my ability to understand concepts and to apply those concepts and to draw judgments from those concepts and those understandings of those concepts. So again, empiricists like David Hume, all knowledge is based on experience. Rationalists, people like Rene Descartes, maybe you're familiar with Descartes, I think, therefore I am. He's a rationalist. All knowledge is based on reason. Now, Kant is caught in between the two. Kant comes along towards the end of the modern period, or the early modern period. He's considered by many one of the last of the Enlightenment philosophers. And Kant, you could say he synthesizes these two views. He doesn't say that one is right or the other, but they actually both have some valid points. Hume is correct. If I never had any experience at all, there would be nothing to know. So if I'd never tasted an avocado, I wouldn't have a conception of avocado flavor. But on the other hand, if I go with just my understanding and just my mind without any experience to draw from, there's nothing there either. So for Kant, he strikes this middle ground between the empiricist and the rationalist, and he claims that you have to have both understanding and experience, that these are integral. The mind is presented with certain things, experience, our senses, our emotions, our awareness of our environment, and the mind takes it in and understands it, organizes it in a certain way that we're capable of grasping. And so there's a role for the reason, for the rational element of us, and for the sensual element, the element that sees and hears and tastes and touches. So the empiricist and the rationalist, they've got it half right. They need to put it together. You might think about it this way. You know, Kant's going to argue that the empiricists, they think that we're like a camera and that all we do is just record information. But a camera doesn't understand what it's taking a picture of. If all you had was a camera with no mind, there'd be no understanding. But if you were, let's say you were just a mind and you had no senses at all you were was a mind, and you had never seen anything, you'd never heard anything, you'd never smelled anything, you'd never touched anything, tasted anything, you never had any emotions, you just thought. What would you think of? Kant says you would think of nothing. There's nothing there. There is no empty thought. Thought is always of some content, and content is always experiential, having to do with experience. And so both of these are elements of knowledge. Now, how does this apply to art? Well, Kant thinks that all of our experience in general is organized by what he calls categories. I don't think that our translation, I don't think they use the word categories. I can't quite remember. I think they might use a different term than categories. But typically when you read a translation of Kant, you'll hear about the categories of the understanding. And so for him, all human beings are hardwired with these categories of understanding, so that anytime we see something, we don't just see it as a bunch of chaos. It's not just, I don't walk into a room and, see, book, paper, pen, chair, table. I don't have just a list of crap, just a list of pile of stuff. I see my office, right? It's all organized in a certain way, and it appears to me as a coherent whole. So the understanding, what Kant calls the understanding, you might just call it your mind. Your mind takes in all of these inputs, all of the sensory data, and it makes sense of them. It organizes them. It takes note of certain things, other things recede into the background, and so there's this sort of process. And so again, you could maybe see the mind as a kind of filter. We get all the inputs, and the mind filters them and makes sense of them, and we have a coherent, meaningful experience. Now, when it comes to works of art, he says, there's something about works of art that is completely unique. The way we experience works of art is unlike any other thing. It can't be quite categorized in the way that we categorize other things. In fact, it escapes the normal categories of understanding. It escapes our ability to put one sort of answer onto the problem. And so it forces us to exercise our imagination, says Kant. And so art gives us this function of sharpening our wits and exercising our imagination. And for him, that is the key to what we call aesthetic experience, experience of objects of beauty. Is that it shakes us up like this. I hate to use the word shake because that's too emotional. Like Hume, Kant thinks that we should be very detached and contemplative, very intellectual when we're looking at works of art, and not be all emotional and frenzied. But he does think that it does make our mind exercise itself in very unique ways that is very beneficial and very stimulating. Maybe not in a sensual or pleasurable way, the way Hume has it, but more of an intellectual way. Okay, so I think that's probably a good place to stop. I could say more about Kant, but I feel like we covered a lot of ground today. So I think I better just shut up right now. It's 2:43 according to my watch, so that's a pretty good time to stop. I'll stick around. I'm going to go ahead and leave the meeting open for just a minute or two. But if you want to leave, your class is dismissed, free to go. But if you want to stick around and ask me any questions or you have any comments, I'm here to listen up. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.